Shalom, shalom, and welcome to Bet Ariel Wednesday Bible Study. We're continuing our study on Messiah in Isaiah. We've seen in our first study how this book begins abruptly with a strong denunciation of the sinful condition of the nation. This stern rebuke went out against the civil and religious leaders. It seems like nothing was working at this point. It looks like they had reached a point of no return. And here the reader may be surprised to see the Lord using words like sinful nation, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly, and on and on. And one wonders why such powerful criticism and blame. These words, I want to tell you, are not given to put down, they're given to awaken the spirit inside. This speech could be considered as the cry of a father to his sons and daughters who warns them about the coming calamities and the great judgments that their own sins produced. However, the whole chapter, the whole book is written with such language so that all along the reader is brought to seek help away from the religious leaders and the civil authorities, away from man, but to God who provides them with salvation. That is, I believe, the strategy here. This salvation the Lord delivers through the Messiah, who is really the red string of hope, the tikva, which runs through the book. And today we'll look at the place in Isaiah in the history of Israel, because he marks and opens the era of the 16 writing prophets. I have many charts to show you. By the way, these new charts are added in the handout in the website at betariel.ca. If you actually downloaded it last week, you can go back and download these charts. Now, from there, we will understand that it's better the place of Israel than today and in the future. And we'll also consider the first verses of chapter 1. Now, before this, as we usually do, we'll take a question we have received this week. Sharon will read the question for us.
Dear Pastor Gabizon, please, what does this verse mean? From Daniel 12, verses 11 to 12, it says, "From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days."
Well, thank you for writing. This is indeed a very interesting question. I will briefly answer it, but you can get more information by looking in our last study on Daniel, the book of Daniel in chapter 12. You'll find this in our website as well. So the passage in Daniel 12, verses 1 to 11, adds another 30 days to the 1,260 days that we find in Revelation 11 and 12, or the 3.5 years of the tribulation. So Daniel also specifies that these 1,290 days will begin at the abomination of desolations, which triggers the second half of the tribulation. That is the last 1,260 days of the 7-year tribulation. And furthermore, Daniel also adds another 45 days to the whole, making it 1,335 days. Now let us concentrate on the added 30 days. I want to tell you a beautiful story behind it. The question is, should we place the 30 days at the beginning, the end, or in the middle somewhere of the last 3.5 years? And what would be the purpose of these extra 30 days? Now, the majority of modern day commentators place these 30 days at the end of the tribulation along with the extra 45 days and see them as one 75-day interval in between the tribulation and the millennium as the time and place for the judgment of the nations, as we read this judgment in Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. However, Daniel divides these 75 days into 30 and 45 days, and most ancient rabbis and church fathers place the 30 days before the tribulation and the 45 days after the tribulation. Ibn Ezra, a well-known medieval rabbi, saw it before the destruction of the temple, before the abomination of desolation mentioned in Daniel 12, verse 7. He saw it also as a future event. Jerome, in the 5th century, also puts it first or within the last 3.5 years. And he says, and I quote, "For he is going to persecute the saints for 3.5 years, or 1,290 days. For him, the text here gives a more exact duration. If they are right, where can we find these 30 extra days to come up to 1,290 days? Is there a floating month somewhere in the Hebrew calendar we can find and add that within the 3.5 years? Yes, there is one 30 days actually when we consider the leap year of the Hebrew calendar. Okay, follow me, it is worth it. This calendar, which is a lunar solar calendar, adds an extra lunar month 7 times each cycle of 19 years. So this month is called Adar Aleph or Adar Rishon and may represent this extra month. But what might be the purpose of having this extra month added right there? Perhaps this additional time will give opportunity for the Jewish believers to flee, to escape to the mountains, to Petra or Bozrah, before the effect of the abomination of desolation actually begins. Remember what Jesus says, the warning that we find in Matthew 24:15 to 16. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. And he's referring to our place here in Daniel 12:11 to 12. And verse 16, he says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. One will find it very hard to flee in time of actual war. So perhaps a time will be given for the Jewish believers to flee during these 30 days. Perhaps those fleeing will take further courage, knowing that the Messianic Jews of the first century also had a bubble of time, that is, to escape Jerusalem before the onslaught of the Romans and the destruction of the Second Temple when they read the prophecy of Jesus. So historians have written about the escape of the Messianic Jews to a city called Pella. So this extra month given by Daniel, which he inserted within the last 2.5 years of the tribulation, may very well be a time of escape for the Jewish remnant in Israel. When the abomination of desolation begins, the exact time when Yeshua tells them to flee, for as we read in Revelation 12:12, the devil has come down to you having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. And so God protects the remnant of Israel at the time by giving them to flee. And this we read also in Revelation 12:14, so that she, that is Israel, could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time and times and half a times from the presence of the serpent, that is 3.5 years. Now I understand that all this may sound very complicated, but it is worth putting the time into these things, for there we see the goodness of the Lord and how present he will be in the tribulation time, as he is every time a believer suffers, right? And so this is a great illustration of his presence. Now let us see how Isaiah brings the message to the people. We are in page 4 of the handout section that you can download from the website. So Isaiah, like the other prophets to Jerusalem, could be seen as prosecutors. The prophets were like prosecuting attorneys. What is a prosecuting attorney? It is an attorney who conducts proceedings in a court on behalf of a government. Here the government is God. Israel was a theocracy, and under God, and the law itself is the Mosaic law. So it's always in the background of what the prophets will say. There are a few important points which will help us understand the trends of the prophet's argument. Right at the birth of the nation of Israel, and remember this, in Exodus, Israel was elected to be a priestly nation. Her task was to bring the word of and knowledge of God to the people of the world. And in order to train her to do so, God gave her the Mosaic law. The law spoke of sin, it spoke of justice and holiness, and of the coming of the Messiah, something Israel was called to grasp and proclaim to the nations, something she will do during the tribulation through the 144,000 and also in the millennium. So this is why she is called a priestly nation. The law brought the knowledge of sin and at the same time pointed to the Messiah, who was the only one who could deliver them from the judgment of the law, which condemned them, for they could not follow the law without breaking it. However, by the time of Isaiah, she was very far from the word of God. And as a consequence, she lost the benefit of the land and the benefit of so many blessings. This is the message of Isaiah and the other prophets. At the time of the prophet, she is seen very close to the moment she was about to lose all her land. And also, of course, the temple and Jerusalem. Now, let me show you a map that puts the 16 writing prophets led by Isaiah in relation to the history of Israel. If we get these points, Isaiah and all the other prophets will become easier to read. The dates on the maps are rounded up so it's easily remembered. From the promise of a nation to Abraham about 2000 BC to the birth of the nation with Moses and entrance to the land approximately 1500 BC, to David approximately 1000 BC, to the beginning of the diaspora and the times of the Gentiles in 586 BC, leading to the complete diaspora in 70 AD, to the return of the Jews to the land of 1948, that is in 1948. Okay, these are the main dates in the history of Israel. Notice these events are divided into 500-year segments of time. It's easily remembered. But see where the prophets are placed. Just before the diaspora, they were warning the people of the consequences of their sins. They were the prosecutors, and also they were lawyers as well, because many times they will turn to God and plead for Israel. Plead for Israel. So while the election of Israel is unconditional in all this, the enjoyment of the land was linked to the obedience of the law. That enjoyment was conditional on their obedience to the law. This is why Israel, for the last 2,000 years and even 2,500 years, was away from her land. Again, their disobedience did not affect their election, but rather affected their enjoyment of the blessing, just like it is with the believers today. When we break the law of the Messiah, we do not lose our salvation. We are eternally blessed. We are eternally believers. Heaven is ours. But we will miss the blessings of the Lord. As it is with Israel, so it is with God's chosen people. And here, in Isaiah, we are the breaking point, just before the top, the greatest punishment of Israel, which is the diaspora, the expulsion unto the nation where she suffered so much, and she's still suffering. Now, in order to further appreciate Isaiah's words of judgment and of blessing, let us briefly read a few stipulations of the consequence of obeying and of disobeying the law formulated by Moses. This is found in Deuteronomy 28 and also in Leviticus 26. And Moses gave these words even before the Jewish people entered their land for the first time. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 28. Those who follow the study of Israel, past, present, and future, are already familiar with these passages. Okay, but it's so good to go back to them. And there we can understand the obligations given to the nation of Israel. From verses 1 to 14, we have the blessings for Israel. In the event that Israel followed the Mosaic law, she would have been so blessed. Sharon will read for us the first 4 verses.
Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. And all the blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, and the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks.
All of these things and more would have been such a great blessing had Israel followed the law of God, or at best, what a blessing if she had recognized that she could not follow and carry through on everything and look unto the Messiah who did it for us. That might have been led them, that is, a lot earlier to seek for and understand the need for a Redeemer. However, in verses 15 to 68, from 15 to verse 68, we find the punishment, and there are so many, all based on the choice Israel makes, whether she follows them or not. And the judgments, I want to tell you, are very severe. Let us just read verses 15 to 18.
But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body, and the produce of your land, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks.
Do you see the gravity of disobedience? In chapters 28 to 29 alone, we find the word cursed mentioned 10 times. We clearly see that to whom much is given, much is required, just like the believer today. And in the subsequent verses, we can see the history of Israel from the past 2,000 years up to today. All these verses are hard, that is, to read, but they are very revealing. Take note of the ultimate punishment, that is, the diaspora, the place in time where all the prophets gathered together to warn Israel. You can see this in the chart. In the end of it, all the Jews will be scattered of the nations. So if you ever wonder why the Jews are spread all over the world from the last 2,000 or 2,500 years, if you ever wonder why they are persecuted all of the time, the answer is found in this following passage. Look at verse 64, where God says, "And the Lord will scatter you among all the nations," as they continue to be today. And there they will not have rest because of the constant persecution. History proves that there was not a time when this nation, Israel, was not under persecution by some other nation. This is what is repeated by the prophets over and over so that the people will see and will repent. And they're still speaking today. And the suffering of the diaspora is especially seen in verses 65 to 66, where we see some hints, unfortunately, of the Nazi Holocaust and the other Holocausts that occurred throughout the history, and unfortunately, like Zechariah says, and John as well, of the coming persecution. Verses 65 to 66, Sharon will read them for us.
"And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night, and have no assurance of life."
Now, this is one main reason the prophets of God were sent to the people. This is their main message. They were there to warn them. This is why we see Isaiah standing right at the threshold of this prophecy. And see the other chart. Isaiah really begins the warning before the diaspora. Okay, he comes before the Assyrian dispersion in 721 BC, where the people of the northern tribes were taken captive. You can see this at the bottom of the chart. Then, several decades later, the south part of Israel, Judah, was invaded by the Babylonians in 586 BC, an event which triggered the times of the Gentiles. This is a term which describes the present diaspora of the Jews in the world. Because since then and up to today, the nation of Israel is still under the punishment of the diaspora. Grasping these things, we're going to better understand the message, not only of Isaiah, but of all the other prophets. And so it all begins with Isaiah, who was there with Jonah, Micah, Amos, and Hosea. They were the pioneers and marked the beginning of the denunciation of the religious and civil leaders, which led the nation astray. These, along with Obadiah and Joel, Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, were the pre-exilic prophets before the exile in 586 BC. There were many of them, for the message was important and was vital. The exilic prophet, those who themselves experienced the expulsions, were Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The post-exilic prophets, those who came back, were Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, who actually prepared with the people, of course, the temple for the first coming. And so through them, God was always present with the people of Israel and is still very much For the prophets still speak today. Their words, their prophecies have not yet been completely fulfilled. This is the historical background of the Bible as it relates to the nation of Israel. And how did the people get to the point of losing their blessing? This is where it becomes even more practical for us to consider. What we see when we consider this map is that sin does not happen overnight. Sin takes a long time to develop, and it will surely lead to judgment if it is not dealt with right away. It was true for Israel, it is true for the ecclesia, it is true for the individual believers. Israel did not see it, and the consequences of sin took her over. In the spiritual gift of leadership mentioned in Romans 12, for instance, Paul says, "He who leads with diligence." The word diligence means with haste, in a hurry, right away, because unsolved problems will accumulate and destroy, just like leaven, as we are in the time of the Passover. This is what happened to Israel as its leaders stopped being diligent and allowed sin to grow like leaven. But how did Israel get to this point? Let's figure this one out. You know, this part of history is very relevant again for us today. Let us go back to the time before Isaiah and see how things developed to such a critical condition. The first three kings of Israel, if you remember, were Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul was really not supposed to be king since he was acclaimed by the people and not by God himself. And remember too, Saul was not from the tribe of Judah. He was actually from another tribe. And David should be considered also the first king, and Solomon the second king. Solomon, let's stop with him. The wisest man, technically with his great wisdom, we should have entered the messianic times at that time. And see how the Bible describes Solomon and his wisdom. Look at 1 King, chapter 4, that is verses 29 to 31.
Now God gave Solomon wisdom, and very great discernment, and breadth of mind, like the sand that is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east, and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men.
But he ended up acting foolishly, and the breakup of Israel could be traced really to his folly. Here is a great practical gem for us. Solomon, the wisest man ever, brought Israel into bankruptcy. This is to tell us that no man can save man, only the Messiah. What Solomon ended up doing with all his ideas of riches and with all his expenditures was to bring Israel into financial bankruptcy. He spent money non-stop, and moreover, he left Israel spiritually bankrupt as well, with his outlandish 700 wives and 300 concubines and an unimaginable way of life. However, and this is where is the main problem, notice that many of these women were foreigners who came in polluting Israel with their own religion, with their own gods. So they did not come alone, and they succeeded in bringing Israel into spiritual bankruptcy. See 1 King, chapter 11, verses 1 and 2.
But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love.
Solomon, the wise man, did exactly what the Lord said not to do. You know, I'm so glad I know Yeshua as my personal savior. But this is not the whole story. For among these women was an Ammonite, through whom Rehoboam, his son, was born. Rehoboam was the next king of Judah. So the Ammonites were at odds with the northern tribes. And you can see Ammon in the map, in the upper right of the map. So being an Ammonite, from an Ammonite descent, Rehoboam carried this dislike against the northern part of Israel. So Israel was split into two territories, the north and the south. And from Rehoboam until the diaspora, we have two countries, Judah and Israel. And at time, you know what? They fought against each other. After Solomon and Rehoboam, we begin the sad story of the many kings of Israel and their continuous defiance of God's precepts and commands, to the point where the prophets of God left the place, the palaces that is, and worked from the outside. They were actually kicked out from the presence of the kings. This disobedience is reported to us in the books of 1st, 2nd Kings, and also 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And you can see in the chart the two lines of kings of Israel, okay, in purple, and the kings of Judah in red. Israel had two lines of kings, but it was not supposed to be like this at all, okay? It was a sign of decay. All of these things are there to tell us that the people were in dire need of the Messiah. This is the point of Isaiah. Because what Isaiah is about to demonstrate is that he is the only one able to give a remedy for the whole mess the nation is still living even today. And so through Rehoboam, Israel was broken into two and then followed the diaspora. So important is this diaspora in 586 BC that Jesus himself, and I want to bring this back, called this period of expulsion the times of the Gentiles in Luke 21:24. From this point on, the Jews never really had jurisdiction over the Temple Mount, even today. This is what he said. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. By the time he spoke these words, the diaspora was ongoing for some 450 years and was the last, and it was to last, that is, until the second coming. So the times of the Gentile, a time we are living right now, it comprises the time between the Babylonian diaspora to the second coming. And so it is a time when Israel as a nation will have a spiritual veil, just like Paul explains in his treaty of Israel in Romans 9, 10, 11. He says in Romans 11:25, blindness in part has happened to Israel until where? Until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. The nation as a whole would not believe until later, but individuals can. Individuals can come to a saving knowledge of Yeshua. Individual Jews, like Jewish believers we have today, they are a testimony that blindness is only in part, and God is faithful to in his word. That Israel is back to its land today is not the end of the times of the Gentiles. It is only in preparation for the final wars that are about to come. Many believers that we are in that final end period, but prophecies affirm it has not yet happened. One more point, and the last one before we close, one more point I want to bring. When we consider the prophets, we find that the truth of God was to be sought in the minority. This is in the history of Israel, okay, and not in the majority. If you're a Jewish person listening or watching, okay, you would understand these things. Those who persecuted the prophets and despised them were the religious and civil authorities in Israel, who had and still have a great influence over the majority of the people. Something else we see is that what this leadership decided to do to the prophets, they also did to Yeshua. They often ask us, as Messianic Jews, that is, Jews who believe in Yeshua, why did the rabbis not believe in Yeshua? Just see the history of Israel, and that will confirm that rejection of God's prophets and the word started very long time ago. Thank you for watching. May the Lord bless you. I will see you next week.
Hallelujah, Adonai, kol goyim. Shabechu kol ha'umim. Ki kafar aleinu hasdom, ve'emet Adonai le'olam. Hallelujah. ואמת אדוני לעולם. הללויה, 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 הללויה. הללו את אדוני כל גוי, הללו את אדוני כל גוי, שבחו כל חרומי, שבחו כל חרומי, כי גבר עלינו הסדום, ואמת אדוני לעולם. הללו, הללויה, כי גבר עלינו חסדו, ואמת אדוני לעולם.